Hello, everyone. Super excited to be here in the Netherlands giving this talk to you. As you can tell, the title is Building Beginner-Friendly API Tutorials, and I will get more into that, but first I'll just introduce myself. My name's Alaina. You can find me on Twitter at that handle, which is my full name. I work at Medium, yes, the blogging company. I'm a software engineer there, but I do a lot of freelance technical writing on my own. I've been published by a myriad of the Free Code Camp, etc., those types of publications, and then also I have freelanced with Twilio and Clarify, which are two American DevRel companies. And you can learn more about me on my website, but for now, on to the beginner-friendly APIs. So, look at these four emoji people. The first one looks pretty eager. The second one is overwhelmed, I'd say. The third is frustrated, and the fourth looks like she knows what she's doing. What could these four people possibly have in common? Well, these are the emotions that readers, especially first-time readers, feel upon looking through your API documentation. It's pretty cool to see that at least two people responded positively, but I mean, that's only half. That's not enough. There's still two who feel frustrated or overwhelmed by your documentation. As someone who writes API docs or just builds the API, you'd like to make newcomers to your API feel excited. User happiness is crucial for user retention. And retention is the linchpin of building a strong API community. So how can you optimize your docs for beginner happiness? So I know this is a docs conference and not everyone thinks of tutorials as documentation, but they are, and let's be real, beginners love tutorials. It's important to have tutorials in addition to traditional documentation in order to give beginners an accessible, low-stakes onboarding experience. Tutorials give beginners their first taste of an API. They provide new users with a quick example of how to use that API. And if a user's initial experience is straightforward, they're going to assume that your API is relatively straightforward, and then they'll be likely to come back and use your API once again. This means that tutorials are effectively the gateway to your API. They should demonstrate how simple yet effective and strong your API is in order to motivate them to become a regular intentional user. But the good intentions of technical writers, API developers, people in DevRel do not always translate to good tutorials. If an API tutorial is not thoughtfully and empathetically written, it can turn beginners off from your API. Poor tutorials diminish user retention and thus the fortitude of your API community. So I'll give an example back with our emoji friends over here. So I know you remember these two. Let me explain why they're feeling what they're feeling, just to give some case studies. So she is overwhelmed by error messages that keep popping up whenever she tries to execute code from the tutorial. She copy-pasted the final code directly from the tutorial into her IDE, and she has no idea why it's not working right out of the box. She fears that her lack of experience as a developer is a blocker to her using this API, and she is just thinking that it's her fault that she can't do this. He, on the other hand, is frustrated by what he thinks are gaps in the tutorial. He followed along up until the last step, and then the author just added in some crazy logic that he didn't understand. He wonders if the fact that he doesn't understand this last step means that he can't use the API in general. And as we can tell here, what the writer thinks that the reader knows is not what the reader actually knows. This writer-reader chasm can best be described as the writer's curse of knowledge. It is the curse of knowledge that sometimes leads engineers and technical writers to produce these flawed API tutorials. So what does this curse of knowledge actually look like? Well, I'll lay it out for you. The people who write API tutorials tend to be intimately familiar with their API. Perhaps they even coded it themselves. On the other hand, the people who read API tutorials are probably experiencing that API for the very first time. It is exceedingly difficult for an API maintainer to communicate with an API newcomer just because their expertise can actually taint the way in which they communicate about their API. Non-beginner-friendly tutorials follow a similar pattern. First, writers assume that readers think about an API in the same ways that they do. Then readers leave because they're perplexed, frustrated, overwhelmed, flummoxed, you name it. And they don't like that the writer is making assumptions about what they know. Then, if the readers leave, especially the beginning readers, there's no community growth and the API and its community suffers. So it's pretty clear that API tutorials have a huge impact on the API community. They're quite essential to developer experience. Now that we know how much API tutorials matter, what can we do in order to write tutorials that are better at retaining users and keeping users happy? So I believe that this is all in the proofreading. I'll cut the writers in this room some slack because I know what it's like. It's hard to focus on anything besides getting words on a page when you're writing a tutorial. However, after you produce that first draft, there are several proofreading techniques that you can use to make your tutorials beginner-friendly before you hit the publish button. You probably already proofread. It's just the natural way to improve your writing. And it's honestly the writer's chance to look at their writing with fresh eyes. As a writer, you should also set proofreading time aside to look at your tutorial from the perspective of a newcomer. So it seems like 7 is a popular number today. I'll also share with you 7 proofreading techniques that you can use to build better beginner-friendly API tutorials. By the end of this talk, you'll be well equipped to proofread your API tutorials so that they will read well for beginners. Some of the techniques that I'll discuss can be applied to other aspects of API documentation, I'm sure. Again, feel free to take these and do what you will with them. So, let's get going. My first proofreading technique is to offer a quick start. When you're writing a tutorial, you produce a code script, or just some sort of chunk of code, that demonstrates a thing that your API does. In most tutorials, this script is broken up into these mini code blocks that you intend for the reader to build upon incrementally. I know that all of us would like, for our beginners, to follow a tutorial step by step, but realistically that's not always what they want to do. So I suggest that you provide new users with thoroughly commented, easy to copy and paste script that they can use to try out your API before working through your tutorial piece by piece. All this requires you to do is to share a link to a copy of your final code and just put it at the beginning or end of your tutorial. Getting new users in front of working code as early as possible shows them how painless it is to use your API. Offering a quick start shifts beginners' focus to tinkering and playing with your API, which honestly sounds a lot more fun and can help them build hype and excitement about your product. So I have an example here from a company that I've worked with called Clarify in the United States. Clarify has a very beautiful quick start portal, actually, over at the following URL. I took a screenshot of the Python example, which I have used in the past. I think that this quick start does two things very well. It includes tutorial-like commands and explanations in the comments, which is very powerful. And it offers a very simple, bare-bones API example that can be expanded upon by an enthusiastic novice, but just someone that wants to see what your API does can just run this and move on in their day. So the second proofreading technique that you can use is to perform a tech audit. Now, I'm going to presume that tech audit is a new term for most of the audience, so I'll go ahead and explain it. What a tech audit means is that you should follow your tutorial verbatim, coding along from start to finish, and see what you actually end up with. Did you get your intended final product? Are there any unexpected errors or additional things you had to do along the way? And of course, did you find typos? Performing a tech audit on your tutorial is important because if the writer can't build the product from scratch, there's just no way that the reader can. Beginners to your API don't stand a chance against the tutorial that failed a tech audit. So I have to give some credit here. I first learned about tech audits when I was freelancing with Twilio. I wrote an introductory tutorial about how to send a text message, just one text message, using Go and the Twilio REST API. And I had to proofread it with a tech audit to prove to myself and the developer evangelist that, yes, a beginner could follow this tutorial and it actually worked as advertised. And you can check out this tutorial at the link on the bottom of this slide. The third proofreading for beginner friendliness technique is to remember your environment. That can mean anything from your command line interface to your development environment or a host of other things. The chance that you and your readers have the same environment is slim to none. You should proofread with this thought in mind. In the first draft of your API tutorial, you probably made some environment-based assumptions. This is normal. One particularly egregious one that comes to mind for me is a lot of times when I read Python tutorials, I see assumptions about virtual env in there, and I don't have that installed properly on some of my machines, so that can lead to me seeing some really spooky errors, as I said here. The writer's unstated assumptions manifest themselves to the reader as these really scary looking errors. And if you're a beginner, these errors can be super difficult to parse and debug. Writers must challenge their underlying assumptions about their environment. With proofreading, you should go through each code block of your tutorial line by line and tease out any setup or dependency or other environment-based details that you left out of your API tutorial. And remember, it's often beginners who turn to API tutorials to learn how to use an API, so simple reminders are super welcome for beginners. And what seems simple to you may not be for a newcomer. So it's better to over-communicate something about your tutorial than to under-communicate. I hope you'll forgive me that this example isn't from an API-centric company because I couldn't find a great one. This is actually a tutorial that I live streamed a while back for a group of other women at university developers about how to use TweetPy, which is like a Twitter Python wrapper. Before I even started to live code, I knew that my audience was even less experienced than I was, so I created this setup slide and left it up for a good minute so that people had enough time to at least go to the right links and figure out how to set up Python appropriately on their machine. Though this is a video and not a written tutorial, what you can do is preface your written tutorials with a similar list of dependencies and environment setup instructions. The fourth proofreading for beginner friendliness technique is to share next steps. I'll open with a caveat. With the exception of the quick start, I'm making the assumption that this tutorial is like an onboarding type tutorial, the true place where beginners should start. That's why I'm only talking about next steps and not previous steps here. So moving on with next steps. The purpose of sharing next steps is to tell the beginner what you would like them to do upon finishing your API tutorial. A next steps section should answer some of the following questions. What should they do when they complete the tutorial? Where can they find information to supplement their knowledge of your API and go on building cooler and even better things? To whom can they ask their burning questions about your API? Who can they talk to share all of the awesome things that they want to build? Who can they collaborate with? I believe that Slack does an especially good job of telling the reader what to do after finishing their Python client tutorial. They provide follow-up links to documentation, and not just the general docs links. They get pretty specific with those 3 first links about what they think that you would like to do after you work through the Python tutorial. They also direct you to the appropriate links for troubleshooting with various dependencies. And another great thing is in the Where to Find Help section, they offer links to their Slack community and Stack Overflow communities. And just an additional bonus awesome thing, that sentence, wondering what to do if you can't get this dang tutorial to work for you, is awesome because it takes the blame off of the beginner and puts it onto the API developers, because there's always something that the developers and technical writers can do better to make this more beginner friendly. So my 5th proofreading technique is to anticipate errors. Let's see. Sorry, having a small phone difficulty. Bear with me a second. All right, I'm back on track.
Anticipate errors.
Anticipate errors. Anticipate errors. Fitting. So, I mean, we've been talking about errors this whole time, realistically, right? And we're all looking at this slide, seeing me experience an error. I'm also looking at this slide and thinking that you think that I'm crazy and being like, oh, we haven't been talking about errors this whole time. But this slide is different. So what I'm talking about is what you actually do upon realizing that a beginner could come across an error in your tutorial or end up with an error state. I like to call this like a turning point of your tutorial, which is like a place in which a beginner either hits a success state or a fail state. And if they hit the fail state and you don't support them, then they're probably going to turn away from your API. So go through your tutorial and identify places where you expect to see some sort of manifestation of success. Like I was saying, a turning point. A manifestation of success can just look like output on the console, or just some sort of state that they need to reach before they can move on to a next step. after you've marked all these turning points in your tutorial, you can ask yourself, what happens if the beginner does not see the output that I expect them to see here? So at the proofreading stage, the answer is probably the beginner won't have any help, and that's something that you can fix because we're still proofreading. You probably haven't written any steps for how to handle failure at these turning points. If a beginner were to go through now your tutorial, they'd probably turn away from your API. So at each turning point, something that you can do is write out an else case, what the beginner can do if they don't see the signs of success that you expect. As the writer, it is your responsibility to get these beginners back on track with using your API and creating something cool for the first time. Although you can't save them every single time, you can at least offer a helping hand. So these two excerpts are from my Twilio tutorial from earlier, where I thought a lot during the proofreading phase about where people could fail during this tutorial. So these are two particular turning points, one in which you either see the proper HTTP status code or you don't, and the other in which you send a text message or you do not. And as you can see here, I spend some time discussing the else case, but not so much time that it detracts from the tutorial itself. So I found a balance between going on a tangent, but not taking away the experience of the tutorial. That's the helping hand. My sixth proofreading technique is to stick to the standard library as much as possible. Realistically, we can't always eliminate dependencies, but we should at least think critically and seek to minimize dependencies on external, not API-related libraries. And the reason for this is because a lot of beginners don't write idiomatic code. They don't know that certain libraries offer shortcuts or new functionality that the language itself doesn't possess, so these new libraries could perplex them more than it's worth. So tutorial writers should keep their syntax as vanilla as possible. That way, we won't make assumptions about how much of the language a beginner knows, and they can easily turn to Google and type in some keyword or term and then figure it out. Using our API shouldn't require language expertise after all, that doesn't make sense. We should also meet beginners at their level by writing verbose, well-commented code examples, rather than putting in some idiomatic shortcut and not explaining it. I'll say it one more time, limiting dependencies is important. Keeping tutorial code as standard as possible will allow more beginners to understand it. If you wrote a tutorial that uses a lot of dependencies, something that you can do is cross-reference each dependency, so critically think about whether or not you really need it, and if you don't need it, write out that code in another, more verbose way. So we do use non-standard libraries from time to time in our tutorial, and sometimes that's important and necessary. When we do use these dependencies, we should tell the reader why we're doing what we're doing. By exposing them to our decision-making process, we're giving them insight into the design decisions that engineers make on a day-to-day basis, which is just great for their programming knowledge in general. So something that you can do is add a comment to each of your import statements with a brief explanation of why each library is important to the tutorial. So this is a small example of one of the rare cases that I've seen of just pure HTML plus a few additional things by this email API called Hamel. There's limited comments besides in the paragraphs, etc. themselves. However, this is a quite standard HTML code block and doesn't look super confusing, which is one thing that Hamel does very well. So finally hitting the wonderful number 7. The 7th proofreading technique is to use inclusive language in your tutorials. Inclusive language matters a lot in technical writing. After all, the words that you write in your tutorials determine who has access to them and who would want to keep reading. Word choice determines who will stick with your content, and it honestly makes the demographics of your API a self-fulfilling prophecy. By not choosing language that suits an audience of diverse backgrounds and skill levels, you will be limiting the growth of your API community. This is why it is important that you, the API documentation engineer or writer, use words that are inclusive to people of a variety of backgrounds. When you produce the first draft of your API tutorial, it's understandable that you won't have inclusive language at the forefront of your mind. So inclusivity and inclusive language fits well into the proofreading process. So for jargon and acronyms, the thing to do is to either define them using Wikipedia or your own definitions, or avoid them entirely. If you avoid them entirely, an advantage of this might be the fact that if you try to define something on your own, you might misrepresent it. So another thing that you can do in proofreading is to stick to pronouns like you, they, and we, rather than he or she, for instance. And this sounds relatively easy, but there are other ways that your unconscious biases might sneak out. So something that you could do is ask a trusted coworker to read through your writing and help you tease some of those out of your tutorial. Then I'll go quickly here, because this is not an API example, but I recommend that anyone interested in inclusive writing take a look at this link, because it's the most comprehensive guide that I've seen. So everyone, we've done it. We've emerged on the other side of 7 proofreading techniques that technical writers can use to make their APIs more beginner-friendly. My list of proofreading techniques is definitely not exhaustive, so feel free to incorporate them into your proofreading process and make variations of them, do what you will with them. I think that the most important takeaway from this talk is that there's no better time than proofreading to make your tutorial accessible and inclusive, and in fact it's something important that you should focus on during proofreading. So proofreading, as I mentioned, improves the quality of your API tutorials, and proofreading is the best time to make them beginner-friendly and accessible, which relates directly to their quality. Quality, which, again, accessibility, beginner-friendliness, tutorials, leads to retention of newcomers as your API users. Retention of newcomers fosters a healthy, burgeoning API community, which is what you would ultimately like, these successful, happy users. And finally, a community that is welcoming and supportive to beginners augments API growth in the future. And realistically, what beginner wouldn't want to try out that community to join? So remember our emoji people from the start of the talk? They're back, but clearly in a lot better state. We have 4 out of 4 happy API users. And I think that these are the people that you should seek out as your beginners. You would ultimately like to produce these happy, successful beginners. And a great way to do that is by building beginner-friendly API tutorials. All you need to do that is to work on your proofreading. So thank you very much. This is my first time doing this